In this presentation, we are going to cover the elements of art. Now, the elements are the tools an artist uses to create an artwork. As you can see, here are a few of them on this slide, like line and shape, form, value, texture. These are the physical properties in an artwork. The artist can draw a line, can imply texture, or create a real physical texture in the artwork. So these are words that you'll be familiar with, but you might not be familiar with all the different ways that an artist can use them. If you have not yet read the chapter, you need to go to your textbook and read the Elements of Art chapter. Without that chapter, it's going to be very difficult to understand this lesson. There is a lot of information here, and I give you small tidbits of information rather than going through them in depth. And so you will be overwhelmed by this information and it won't all make sense unless you've read the chapter beforehand. The first element that we look at is the element of line. Line is something that we know. You know what a line is, but understanding what the difference between an implied line and an actual line is something that is what we'll focus on here. So an implied line is a line that is finished with the eye, whereas an actual line is a continuous line. In the next painting we'll take a look at here, we have this nice landscape. The horizon line, which is this yellow hill, you can take a look and you see where the blue sky meets the yellow hill, we have an actual line. It's a continuous line from one side to the other that defines the blue shape and the yellow shape. However, if you notice, the tops of the trees create a suggested line. We see this nice curved line created by the tops of the trees, almost like a dotted line would be created. We see another in the hay bales that create a line heading back into space. So the largest one on the left in front takes us back where it meets the shadow to the next where the hay bale meets its shadow to the furthest one. And it works as a directional line, a line that leads your eyes somewhere, because it almost makes this implied line almost works like an arrow, right? It leads your eye right back to that country farmhouse in the back. And a lot of times implied lines are used by artists in this suggestive way, where it is a subtle way to direct a viewer's eyes from one place to another. It's also important to understand how different types of lines evoke certain energy. And the reason they evoke certain energy is because this is the way that that in the natural world, these types of lines evoke that kind of energy. So a horizontal line creates kind of a very calming effect, placid or peaceful. Vertical lines seem bold, strong, and assertive, whereas diagonal lines suggest action or change and evoke energy. So thinking about like the sunrise, we see a lot of horizontal lines here, as we do here in the next slide. And both of these have a very peaceful look to them. And the repetition of that horizontal line helps to evoke this. So when an artist uses strong horizontal lines, it will evoke that same emotion. Whereas strong verticals, just like a large redwood tree in the middle of a pinewood forest, evokes that strong, bold, assertive um, feeling, just to kind of give you a sense of how large these redwood trees are. If you've never had a chance to go visit the redwood forest out in California, it's certainly worth a visit. Our class um, of over 30 students could not, if we held hands like this and tried to reach all the way around the tree, would not get all the way around. In fact, they often will carve the center out and create bridges and roads out of them. But trees aren't the only types of vertical lines in nature that evoke strength. Um, we use the same thing in man-made structures. We have uh, a skyscraper here, and it creates a sense of dominance over the environment because man has defied gravity. So it evokes the same thing. Now, um, the diagonal lines will suggest some sort of change, right? Here we have a man running. Here we have some trees swaying in a storm. So that strong diagonal is suggesting that movement, that change, and the energy that a hurricane would cause to be able to fold down a tree. Now, when we look at something non-representational, these types of lines will affect the energy in the artwork. However, line is not going to be the only element used. So it's important to think about this in consideration with the other elements used. In this particular artwork, there's a division between this cool, calm blue and the strong horizontal lines that do evoke the peacefulness. But down below, we have this very cruel, muddy, stormy um, grays and yellow, and that evokes a very different kind of energy and sadness. Maybe not even sadness, but it it has like a very moody esqueness to it. And so that kind of calm and peaceful feeling we see on the top half is kind of contrasting the more storminess that we see on the bottom, almost like contrasting the difference between a bright blue sky and a stormy gray sky, if you understand. And so we can't divorce color. You can't say, look at an artwork and just because it has horizontal lines, assume that that's the emotion there. You have to really look at the artwork and really read the artwork for what it has and what it's worth. Here we have a lot of strong verticals, but it's not just the verticals because a lot of the verticals are very thin. Really, the strength of the colors themselves, along with those verticals, have a very bold um, evocation here in the artwork. In this particular watercolor painting, the diagonals do evoke a sense of change and quickness, but it's not just the diagonals that suggest that quickness and change. The actual uh, look of the artwork, the way that you see the brushstroke moving through the work, like the the stroke itself suggests that same kind of fastness and that fluidity in the work. And so again, it's not just one element that we consider when we look at the way an artist created the artwork. The elements are the first part of a visual analysis. And in that analysis, we are asking ourselves what decisions the artist made um, while they were creating the artwork. And so it's important to be able to analyze those. So here, line is certainly very important, but the fluidity of that brushstroke and the texture that that creates is also very important. And you would want to notate both. The last non-representational artwork, as we look through this, is this one here. Now this does have that horizontal line. It's not a perfect horizontal line. It's a little bit of an obscured horizon line, but we would still see this as a horizontal line, but it doesn't have the calming effect. Maybe the colors in the background evoke that kind of sense of peacefulness because it does have that blue and the pale darker yellows and the grays, but the line itself is created from very bold colors, and those bold colors are small vertical strokes. And so the vertical stroke, even though they're not strong vertical lines, the little vertical line and the bold color evokes more of a sense of that boldness. And so that starts to contrast the peacefulness of the colors used in the background. And so that's one of those things where you can't just, because we have a horizon line here, you can't just say horizontal lines create a calming, peaceful artwork, and that's what is here, and move on. You have to really look at what the artist created and really analyze the decisions that they made. And clearly, the color choice here changes the emotion. The next type of line that we're going to look at is the difference between outline and contour. So outline defines the two-dimensional shape, and contour will record the 3D form. Both of these, again, notice they are a line definition. So we are recording the boundary of 3D forms through line. Here we have an example. We have two different roses here. The rose on the left, each petal is outlined. Notice how each petal is still just a shape. We don't have an idea of how it exists in space. It still is quite flat. And so we would describe this as an outline. However, on the right-hand side, we have a contour line drawing of a rose. Here, we have a clear representation of how the rose would exist in space itself. So we have the three-dimensional recorded boundaries, the way that the petals fold up and back and down and around themselves. We have a clear understanding of how each petal exists within space. That is the clear difference between outline and contour. So without that extra information of what it looks like as a three-dimensional object, it is not contour line. Notice there's no value in this object as well. It is not through value that the three-dimensional boundary is recorded, but strictly through line. In this little artwork, we have all sorts of different lines available to us. In fact, each line definition is here. If you notice, we've got quite a few actual lines. The clearest one you'll notice goes up the left side of the mountain and down the right side of the mountain. It is a continuous line, both from the left side and the right side of the mountain. We also have some implied lines. The clearest implied line connects the horse and the man in the front, and then follows us back to that left-hand side of that mountain. And so we move ourselves all the way back, and that suggests motion as well as we imagine them walking, marching themselves back in space. Now, we have quite a few outlines. A lot of their clothing has outlines. This rice paper hat on the figure just left of the man in front is a clear, defined outline. However, if we look at the mountain itself, there's a little bit of value suggested here, but really, if you look, it's the extra lines themselves. There's a little bit of hatching here, a little bit of cross hatching. These lines give us a clear understanding of the pits and valleys that are on that mountain and help us to imagine what it looks like as a three-dimensional thing, how it exists in space. And so this is what we would describe as contour line. The directional lines that we see here is a line that our eyes naturally follow in an artwork, would certainly be the horse and the man in the front and the people leading us back in space, because that implied line leads us right back to where they meet up with the mountain in the back. What's interesting here is this also will help you understand the different energy in line. If you cover up the man and the horse with your fingers and only look at the people in the diagonal line moving back in space, you will see the energy there, and it should seem pretty energetic, like you feel that movement. Now, if you cover them up and you only look at the man and the horse, that movement feels more stagnant. It doesn't mean that you might not feel like it is suggesting movement. The way that he's leaning and the fact that the horse is raising one of its hooves, it suggests movement. However, it doesn't have the same sense of energy. Like, it doesn't feel like they're moving the same way that the actual action, it doesn't have that. They feel a lot more solid and a lot more more at rest than the people moving back in space. And this is how kind of our subconscious works to read an artwork. The next two elements that we're going to look at are shape and form. Shape is a two-dimensional thing, right? Like the square here on the right. And the form is the 3D representation of the shape. And so form would be the cube that you see next to it. So it's important to kind of understand that. So when we are describing two-dimensional artworks, we use the word shape, although form can be implied when in an artwork that's two-dimensional. If it is realistic enough, we might describe something as form because it looks real. But we would call that implied form, right? Like it's suggested. However, most of the time we describe them as shapes. However, if you're describing a sculpture or architecture, you would always use the word form because it is describing something three-dimensional. So that's like a more physical, that is your three-dimensional description. We have implied shapes and actual shapes. An actual shape is the same concept as the implied versus actual line. An actual shape has a is continuous all the way around, just like the square here. An implied shape is like our planet Jupiter down here. Notice how there's several actual shapes that are used and stacked together to create Jupiter. But the overall circle is implied because they're not connected. So your eyes actually finish the shape, right? You see all those things together and it creates the overall shape as see all those shapes as one thing. We have geometric shapes versus organic shapes. Of course, the geometric shapes are the shapes that have um, names to them that you've learned in math classes, your geometric type shapes, right? Like your squares and your circles and your triangles, and however far you got in math, you will get a really long list of very complicated names. Your organic shapes are like the two that are suggested here. These are your irregular shapes that don't have names. There's a scribbly shape here. The flower here is an organic shape because it has an irregular shape to it. Oftentimes, things that are found in nature are also organic in shape. However, not everything found in nature is organic in shape. Notice the planets themselves are spheres, and so those, though they're found in nature, are geometric in shape. Most man-made things are geometric in shape, but not everything. Notice the mountains are made by nature or made by a higher power depending on your belief system. Those are geometric in shape. And the saxophone is made by man and it is organic in shape. But the human body, the clover, the duck, um, these are things that are found in nature and they are certainly organic in shape. And then we have compound shapes. Now, compound shapes are when many shapes are grouped together and it creates a larger shape. So here the intestines could be described as a compound shape because there's several small shapes that link together to create the larger shape. Here we have the atom, which has several different shapes that kind of come together. And then here, this stack of books, because of the way the books are stacked together, we see this stack as one thing instead of individual books. This is also a compound shape. It's important to understand that. So a group of people could be considered a compound shape. It depends on like how you see it in an artwork. This artwork is the 3rd of May, 1808. It was painted in 1814 by Francisco Goya. And if you notice, we have two strong compound shapes here. We have the soldiers on the right-hand side that have a strong compound shape that is more geometric in nature. And then on the left-hand side, you see the group of victims with the main one, obviously, in the white shirt and yellow pants with his hands up. So the shape starts with him, and then all of the victims to the left of him, including the ones that have already died and are on the ground, all of their sides are connecting to each other, and they look like one group of people. We would call this a compound shape. Goya has decided to create these two compound shapes, and it's clear that this was a strong decision of his. And it's important to kind of understand where this decision came from and how this decision affects the artwork. When you look at this artwork, it is very common, and though some students do, so if you were one of this, if you're thinking this wasn't me, most students relate to the victims. Right from the beginning, without even thinking about it, you see yourself as one of the victims. Now, this doesn't mean you're victimizing yourself, but they're more relatable, they're more humanized. And the fact that the way that the compound shapes are made is a big reason why. Humans are supposed to be organic in shape, and the compound shape of the victims is organic. However, the compound shape of the soldiers, and even if you look at each soldier individually, notice how they are much more geometric. So the compound shape creates more of a the compound shape is more of a trapezoid, And even if you notice, like the very first soldier, he's really built out of two triangles. So it's important to kind of understand that not only is he's taking away kind of the humanness by making them geometric, he's also taking away their identity by facing them away from us. So they're unidentifiable and they're unrelatable to us because they've been stripped of their humanity in that geometric shape. And so, what this does, and one of the things that Goya was known for, was was making artworks that showed the travesty of war. And so, it would make sense that one of the decisions that Goya made here was kind of going out of his way to make the viewer relate to and understand the plight of the victim here and have that human connection to the victim and have the soldier not be identifiable, because it's not that the soldier it's not about which side the soldiers were on. It's not about which country was right or wrong here. It's about the horrors that come from war itself. And here what happened is, and we know that this is certainly true because he has a painting titled The 2nd of May, 1808, which shows what happened the day before this. And the day before this, the people that are all here lined up to be executed, these are just normal citizens that revolted the day before on the 2nd of May in 1808 against the French soldiers that were, these are French soldiers in Portugal, in Spain, that were led by Napoleon at the helm. And so these are Spanish citizens that revolted against the French soldiers, except they didn't really have weapons. So they're fighting with anything they can get their hands on that might be a decent weapon. Of course, they didn't, overpower the soldiers for very long. And this was the punishment. They were all lined up and executed. And so here it's not, he's not blaming the soldiers, but he's taking the human side out of them because he really wants you to relate and understand, that travesty of of the 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 loss of life, and not blaming the soldier, but blaming the war. And so I think that that was a really smart decision as well. Um, Now moving on to our next element, we're going to talk about light and value. Light is the kind of overarching element, and value is a part of light. But because value is so important, especially to two-dimensional artworks, it is all right to separate it. So as we look at this, we're going to talk about value first, and then we'll talk about light and various ways that you can discuss it. So light is the element that reveals the world to your eyes. It helps you understand forms and spatial relationships. If that doesn't make sense to you and you want a physical experiment in understanding this concept, go into a room without windows and turn off the lights. So because it reveals the world to you, and because value is the relative lightness or darkness of an object, value is essentially the way that light falls over an object. Value can be achieved in many different ways. Some of the known ways, especially in older artworks that dealt with pen, printmaking techniques these are created through line and things like that, would be hatching and cross hatching or stippling. Modeling or blending is another technique. In fact, blending became common, that people started using the word blending or shading to describe value, but it's an inaccurate term. So value is the proper term here that we will use for the element. And then I'm going to talk to you about chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro, which you can see, I've hooked you on phonics here, very easy to say, chiaroscuro, is simply in Italian, the first part of that, chiaro, means light, and then scuro means dark, so chiaroscuro was invented during the Renaissance as they observed how light falls over an object and the 5 areas of value there. And if you expressed those 5 values on an object, it could look 3-dimensional. So you could create that form in 2 dimensions. And so that's where chiaroscuro became popular. And then most chiaroscuro artworks used more extreme light and dark. It wasn't just about those 5 areas, but kind of exaggerating the 5 areas so that it was more obvious. So we're going to look at a couple artworks that use chiaroscuro as well. So first, let's look at value modeling in 2 dimensions to create implied mass and form. So again, value is the relative lightness or darkness of an object. That word relative is underlined because it's related. You don't understand that one part is lighter without describing how much lighter it is than another part of the artwork. So it's all relational. So if we're looking at Leonardo da Vinci's The Virgin and St. Anne with Christ Child and John the Baptist, it's important that you're describing how that form is created and how those folds are created by the repetition of light and dark and light and dark, and how that is what is creating those folds and making them look realistic. It's not enough to point out that there's a darker area in the bottom underneath the dress. That's not the decision that Leonardo da Vinci made about value. Here, Leonardo da Vinci chose to use chiaroscuro to create realistic form. That's the decision he made. So it's important to be able to describe that, or to compare the values and describe the way that the value has been achieved and what it's doing for the artwork. Here, Charles White, Untitled 1979, is using a different technique. So the technique here is hatching and cross-hatching. At the top, when there's only one set of parallel lines being used, that's hatching. And when there's the cross, so you've got 2 sets of lines, the parallel lines, and then you cross over it, it's called cross-hatching. Notice how the closer the lines are together, the darker they appear. And if you notice that the lines get much more intricate, and so does the detail as we move into the face. Whereas there's a lot less detail over the head and hair, which creates emphasis on her face. That's part of the decision that Charles White made as he created this artwork, is that the values become more precise and the detail within those values become more precise because of it, if that makes sense. As I stated before, there are 5 areas of value needed to express chiaroscuro. And here they are shown on a ball. So let me just kind of explain what they are. So basically, what this is showing is that there's a light coming down from this angle. And so there's a highlight here from the shining of the light. The midtone is the value of the object, okay? And then the core shadow, as you can kind of see it here to here, means that light is cut off right where it is here, and then on the other side over here. So that means that that's where light no longer hits the object in that core shadow. And you'll notice the further down it gets, because the further it gets away from the light, the darker that core shadow will appear. The cast shadow then will fall within the core shadow. So it starts at the top of the object here. So it'll hit at the beginning of the core shadow and the end, but at the way that the light hits. So basically it depends on how the light hits the object. So we've got that core shadow. And then there's also, because there's light deals with reflections, it's reflecting down onto the table. It hits the table and reflects back up onto the object. So right within that core shadow, we have this beautiful reflected light where the object, like between the core shadow and the cast shadow, because there's light bouncing off the table and coming back up onto the object. So if you set up an apple or a ball, this is what I recommend you guys do. You'll see it and it'll make a lot of sense. If you, an apple works really well, but if you have like a white balls work well too. And take your phone and turn on like your flashlight and hold it above and see if you can find those 5 areas, especially that reflected light. And sometimes the reflected light highlight is difficult to find. And so when you're looking for it, if you squint your eyes, it's easier to find within there. But that's the reason why those 5 areas are required to create that form. Here we have a drawing of a rabbit by Albrecht Dürer. And if you notice, here he's creating it out of line. Now he's emulating the texture. He's using kind of a contour line to create the texture rather than hatching or cross-hatching. This we could describe in terms of value, because brown is not a part of the color spectrum. And so the whites and the browns and the grays and the blacks that we see here all fall within value. So in this particular artwork, to describe the value, one of the things, because again it's relative, we could talk about is how the underside, how Albrecht Dürer here has is describing the rabbit, how the underside of the rabbit is shown with lighter fur than the upper side, because the upper side is peppered with that darker black. And then the further it goes back in space, it gets darker and darker. So that's an observation that's been made, that you're relating one value to the next to the next. And that is how you describe value in relation to the decisions the artist has made. Here we have the, the shepherds. On the right-hand side, we have Mary and Joseph. The center, the baby is meant to be the baby Jesus. And then we have the shepherds on the left-hand side. This is an example of chiaroscuro, except it's in reverse. Usually, instead of the light coming from above, the light is coming from below. So it's a little bit more difficult to understand that fifth area of that reflected highlight, but you can see some of it in the hair subtly, um, and in parts of the dress. You can see it right back in here in areas. But traditional chiaroscuro, we can see here in Caravaggio's Judith beheading Holofernes. This is circa 1598 to 1599 or 1602. Those are the two dates that's been provided, and they're not that we have. Caravaggio was very skilled at utilizing um, chiaroscuro. So we see the highlights here and on the face. The midtone, then we see under the face. We see it here. The on the bicep here. Notice how as we move further back in space, it gets much darker. We have some midtones down here. And then there is some reflective light here on the underside. Notice there's a little reflective light on the underside of this arm, on the underside of her chin, on the underside of her chin. And I'm going to tell you the story of Judith, but I want to show you, because Caravaggio's Judith beheading Holofernes is very popular, but so is Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia is the first famous female artist in history during the Renaissance, and this is Judith slaying Holofernes. This is a Bible story, the story of Judith, and so it is a popular painting theme that's been done again and again. This was done circa 1612 to 1613. This is also oil on canvas. Hers is a little bit more gruesome, as you can see. Now, she didn't have a handmaiden with her, but in both cases, notice that there is a handmaiden in both paintings, and this is because there's another Bible story of another uh, female beheading a man, and to differentiate the two, Judith is always shown with a handmaiden and the other is not. Now, this artwork could be believed to have chiaroscuro, and does in some regards. Like, we do have some implied form here. It does look three-dimensional. There is realism, but it doesn't have that extreme light and dark. We do have highlight, we have midtone, we have cast shadow, core shadow, we have the reflective light or the reflective highlight, and there is a subtle cast shadow in here, but cast shadow is really missing, and so that extreme light is what we're missing. Those cast shadows are necessary, and so even though we have the realism here, that fifth area of that cast shadow is what we're missing to really define this as chiaroscuro. Now, Judith is one of the first examples of feminism. Judith was an Israelite, and Holofernes was the leader of one of the many people coming to overtake the Israelites and take their land from them. They were strong. The Israelites were strongly outnumbered and were ready to give up. But Judith was kind of the only one that was not willing to give up at this point. Everyone else was. No one was willing to fight because they were so strongly outnumbered that they were surely defeated. Judith was a widow, and this is an important part of the story, I think, in terms of a biblical story, because it meant that she had already been with a man. And Holofernes showed interest in her. She went to his tent and seduced him. And afterwards, he fell asleep, and she took a sword and she cut his head off. And you have to keep in mind that during biblical times, if you killed the general, if you killed the leader of the army, you won the war. Like that was part of the rules of engagement back then. And so even though her people were like defeated and had already accepted defeat, she single-handedly saved her people. And so this is one of those stories that shows, how one person can make a difference, I suppose, but it also really shows the power of how you should never underestimate a woman, I suppose. Go feminism. But it's one of the reasons I think why this is such a favorite painting. This story is such a favorite story to use in art. Not only is it kind of a gruesome artwork that you can use like a very kind of juicy reference. I use that word juicy a lot when I talk about artworks. And when I use that word, I mean it like, imagine like biting into a very juicy peach and all the juice is kind of running down your face. Like it's like there's a lot of meat to it. There's it's got a lot of juice. There's all sorts. There's a lot to work with there that is excellent. And so again, it's one of those favorites, not topics, but favorite stories that artists have used. Anyway, both of these, the lighting is important though. If you notice, if we go back one, notice kind of how the light, though we have that chiaroscuro here in Caravaggio's, notice how the highlight is strongly on Judith, where she is almost completely in highlight. Now here, if you notice, the light is really focused on Holofernes' head, right? Like that focal point is not on Judith, right? Judith is half in shadow. Like the focal point is the sword that is halfway through Holofernes' head. So this is much more gruesome, and and so it's kind of important to understand how light has an effect in that, because light certainly is part of what brings your attention to that focal point. This artwork is The Annunciation by Henry Tanner. Henry Tanner was the first famous African American artist shortly after the Civil War. The Annunciation is, in the Christian belief system, is the moment that the Holy Spirit comes to Mary and tells her that she is going to have the Son of God. This artwork is not about chiaroscuro. It is simply an artwork that, and because this artwork is full color and there isn't value, even our shadow is in color here. This is one of those artworks that, because the Holy Spirit is represented by this bright yellow that that appears to be light itself glowing on the canvas, this is where you would describe light as an element. So you can always talk about light in an artwork as an element. There are artists that use light as their medium. Neon artworks, there's sculptures done with light. There's all sorts of different types of work that can use light. But I focus here in the two-dimensional artworks because sometimes it's harder to understand how you might describe light in something two-dimensional. A lot of times it's more obvious in a sculpture that's using actual light in it. But when that light is suggested or important in some way, then you actually just describe the light itself. And in this here, the fact that we have like this very ethereal light glowing on the left-hand side of the artwork, that element of light becomes very important. And literally the sentence I just said is what I would write down in an analysis. The next element we're going to look at is texture. Texture is the element experienced through touch. So when you're looking at actual textures, we describe, what, the actual texture would feel like. But implied textures, we describe what they are. So here is the sculpture of David. It's done in marble. The actual texture is coarse and rough, but it's been sanded down to be smooth as well, right? So that would be the actual texture of the marble. However, we have some implied textures here. Michelangelo has implied skin, and it looks as if when you reach out to touch it, it's going to feel like soft, supple skin instead of marble. That's the implied texture that we see. Here, the painting has an actual texture. The actual texture is the paint itself. Now, we don't see any paint strokes in this, and so it would be probably, it would feel like rough canvas, or depending on how thick the paint is, it would be, just a smooth, silky finish of the paint itself. When you look at an artwork in person or you do research, it should tell you more about the texture, and it would allow you to know what that texture looks like. We've got a lot of implied texture in this particular work. Those petals on the flowers look real enough to touch. The dragonfly in the left-hand corner seems super ominous, like he's gonna fly out and catch me in the eye, like he's too close to me. It freaks me out a little bit. He looks so real. So again, those implied textures, I'm not describing what they would feel like, but I'm actually pointing out what they are and their level of realness, right? All of the implied textures in this artwork are quite real and accurate. The petals, the basket, the different insects, those textures are accurate enough that the insects look alive, that the flowers look moist and silky smooth. The basket, has, a real appearance to it. This is an interesting artwork. This is a sculpture done by Via Selmans to fix an image in memory. This particular sculpture is has 12 stones and 12 bronze sculptures of those stones that she's painted to be identical to them. And so here, this one's a little confusing to think through, which is why I offer it to students because it's important to really wrap your head around this. The actual texture is what the artwork is made out of. This, because there's two different materials, has two different actual textures. The first actual texture would be the smooth bronze, and the second would be the rough rock material, right? So those are our two actual textures because half of them are real rock and half of them are bronze. Now those bronze sculptures have an implied texture as well because that implied texture then is of the rock. So that becomes the really interesting part about this artwork. The next element we're going to look at is color. Color are the colors part of the visual spectrum. This is your Roy G. Biv if you've taken physics, and the rainbow if you haven't. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And then the tertiary colors that fall in that as well. Meaning, you know, like your yellow, orange, or yellow, green. So your primary colors are your red, yellow, and blue. Your secondary colors are violet, orange, and green. I don't care if you use the word purple instead, but I've been using the term violet for so long that I can't really break it. And then your tertiary or your intermediate colors are the colors in between. Red, violet, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. We have a few different concepts here, but really the things that are the most important is to understand additive versus subtractive processes. An additive process is one that uses light. And any process that uses light, like your phone, your computer, the lights in a theater, your digital cameras, your projectors, so on and so forth. Again, anything that's light-based. The more color you add, the color will end up, if you add all of the colors, you will end up getting white light. So the color system is different than the subtractive color system that the traditional color wheel is based off of. And we're looking at a traditional color wheel here. Subtractive color, the more color you add, you lose color. So the subtractive color processes are anything pigment based, like paint, your printers, print screening, like the t-shirts that most people wear, so on and so forth. Like, again, anything pigment based. So it's important to kind of understand that, you know, when you're looking at something on your computer screen, it's going to look brighter than when it gets printed. Oftentimes the reason why you get something in the mail and it looks duller and darker than it did on the computer is simply the difference between the additive and subtractive processes between viewing and making. So if you kind of keep that in mind and kind of imagine what you see slightly lighter, slightly darker and a little duller, you have less of a chance of being disappointed when you get it in the mail. So I want to talk to you about intensity and saturation. So if you look at an artwork and you describe the colors that are in it, that lets me know that you passed kindergarten because you've known what colors are what for a really long time. I expect you to talk about color in an academic way and describe the decisions the artist made. And artists are making much more complicated decisions than just which colors they're using. So you can discuss the intensity and the saturation used and how it affects the mood of an artwork, or you can discuss the color scheme and how that color scheme brings harmony to the artwork. So let's look at intensity and saturation first. Intensity is the lightness or darkness of a color. Essentially, it's value, but value is the absence of color. So we don't use the word value when we're describing color. Instead, we use the word intensity of color. So it's less intense for lighter, it's more intense for darker. It's really intense if it's very dark. It's not very intense if it's very light. The saturation or the chroma is the brilliance or the brightness of a color. It might be muddy or dull if there's a lot of gray in that color. If there's lots of pigment and it's super bright, like the first red here, all on its own, over on the right hand side, that red has lots and lots of pigment. It is very bright. It is fully saturated. As it gets lighter and lighter, it becomes less and less saturated. There's less and less pigment. It's not about it becoming lighter, it's actually about it losing pigment. Okay, so it's important to understand. The top one here shows you the saturation of the color, okay? And then this shows you your black to white value scale. So we are looking at the other ones to understand how saturation and intensity affect color. So if we go 2 over, notice if we go up and down, the value here changes, but notice how the amount of red in the color doesn't change. But if we go from left to right in that top row, notice because we're adding some of that gray, notice that the red itself becomes less and less until it starts to look grayish. So that's what we mean by intensity. Excuse me, that's what we mean by saturation. And when we get to darker values, notice how the saturation is affected a lot faster. So one of the things that I want you to consider is if we have an artwork and all of the colors, not just red, but it's using several colors, and it's only using colors within, say, these 9 options of the different colors. These very muddy, these very dull colors. You know, that would be really good for a very rainy, cloudy, kind of depressing, sad landscape, right? And so when we talk about how that would affect the mood of the artwork, it would certainly make it more depressing or very dull because of the lack of saturation in those colors. So that's when we're discussing it in terms of intensity and saturation, you must also describe how those decisions affect the mood in the artwork. The other way to get credit for the element of color in an analysis is to determine the color scheme used and describe how it creates harmony. The good news is, if an artwork is using a color scheme, it is creating harmony. Automatically, 100%, you don't have to question that because of physics. Our eyes naturally like these colors together. it was scientifically proven, and because of that, artists have been using these particular colors together. It's why the color wheel is set up the way it is. But they've been using certain colors together for a very long time because physics tells us that they are aesthetically pleasing when used in combination. So we know that they will create harmony, but it's important to look at the artwork and determine why they create harmony. So you're just kind of explaining how those colors are working together, basically. So I'm going to explain these 6. Your textbook only has a few of these, and I've added a couple more, only because artists like to use more complicated color schemes sometimes, and I wanted you to have the option because it's important to understand that if you were to when you select your own artwork for the final, if you were to select one with one of these color schemes, I want you to recognize it because they're not that different from the ones in your textbook. The first color scheme is monochromatic. This is an artwork that uses shades and tints of only one color. Notice here the color selected is blue-green. And it's important to understand that this is not blue and blue-green and green, but just blue-green. The next one is complementary. And this is when colors are located opposite of each other from the color wheel. So it's important to download that color wheel handout and have it available as you're analyzing artworks. It's not expected that you have the color wheel memorized and know what colors are opposite of each other and know how to figure this out without them. Okay, this is one of those things where you reference the color wheel as you're trying to determine it. A split complement is one color plus 2 colors adjacent to its complementary colors. And I will explain how to determine the split complement clearly because you start with the predominant color in the artwork. But we're going to get there after we go through these. The next one is a double complement. This is simply when the artist uses 2 sets of complements instead of 1. The next is a triad. This is when there are 3 colors that are equal distance apart on the color wheel. They create an equilateral triangle. And I don't expect you to know all of the triads. Notice the one selected here is the primary colors, the blue, red, and yellow. That's the only triad I expect you to be able to recognize. It is the one used most often throughout art history. And so I want you to be able to recognize when the primary colors are used together that it is a harmonious color scheme called a triadic color scheme. The last one is an analogous color scheme, which are colors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel. There are 3 different ways that analogous color scheme works. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of an analogous color scheme, and I will explain it a little bit further. But let me go ahead and explain it now, just to be clear. So the first example is colors that are directly adjacent to each other on the color wheel. So here we have the example of green, yellow, green, yellow, and yellow, orange. This could continue on to another color as long as they are directly adjacent. The second way an analogous color scheme works is when the artist uses 2 colors and the color that's made when those 2 colors are mixed. So if the artist uses red, blue, and violet, those colors aren't going to be next to each other on a color wheel, right? Because there are tertiary colors in between. But it's not required that they use the tertiary colors to create an analogous color scheme. It falls in this category of color schemes. The third type of analogous color scheme is one that you guys already know and can recognize because you've learned about this since elementary school, and it's the difference between warm and cool colors. So when they are using mostly warm colors or mostly cool colors, then they're also using an analogous color scheme. Just so that you understand, the cutoff for your warm colors are yellow, yellow-orange, orange, red-orange, red, and red-violet. Your cool colors are violet, blue-violet, blue, blue-green, green, and yellow-green. That's the separation between the two. And again, they don't have to be directly adjacent to each other, but if they fall within on one side or the other, then they would be considered analogous. So here we have an artwork that is monochromatic. Only blue is used in this painting. Now, if the artist decided to add a subtle or a bold stroke of a different color, it would no longer be monochromatic. And if that color didn't fall within another color scheme, then the only way to get credit for color would be to describe the intensity and saturation and how they affect the mood of the artwork. Here, the artist is using red and green to create a complementary color scheme. Notice I pointed out which two colors are creating the complementary color scheme. This is necessary to get credit for that complementary color scheme. When we are trying to determine a color scheme, it's always important to start with our key color. The key color is the predominant color, the color that is used most in the artwork. In this particular work, the color used most is yellow. And so while looking at the color wheel handout, we will start with yellow. Now there is some violet in this artwork. They're very subtle amounts of it. There's not a whole lot because most of it is red violet and blue violet. Because there's more red violet and blue violet in this work, and they certainly stand out more than that subtle amount of violet, it makes more sense for this to be a split complement. But a lot of students like to say that a color scheme is a split complement, and sometimes they only offer two colors, and they're not, and they don't fall into this category. Remember, when looking at your color scheme, a color scheme can have extra colors in it, like this one has that violet, but it's important to figure out which colors are most important. We always start with our key color. If we go back here, certainly red is the key color, right? And there's not other colors in this particular work, so it's pretty simple. We know that this is complementary because there's only red and green being used. Now here, we would list our colors. Yellow would be key, so that would be the one that we know has to be in the color scheme. And then below, we would write red, violet, blue, violet, and violet. And we would determine that red, violet, and blue, violet is a lot more important. And so that's how we would make our determination. In this particular artwork, green is certainly the key color. We also have red, we have yellow, and we have violet. You would look at your color wheel and you would determine that red and green are complements, yellow and violet are complements, and that creates a double complementary color scheme. Here, blue again is the key color, and then we're using red and yellow. And that creates our triad or a triadic color scheme. And so that's how we would define this artwork. This particular artwork is analogous. The key color is blue. And the next most important color is yellow. If you look, you'll notice there's a lot of really bright yellows in the artwork. And then as you look through the work, you will see a few other colors. This here is dark green. We've got some subtle greens right through here. This you might guess is red. Upon closer inspection, you might notice that it's actually like a burnt sienna, which is a brown. But even if it was red, you would be able to, determine that it certainly is not more important than the green. There are very subtle amounts of orange right in here. There's some more green over here. And then there's varying tints and shades of blue, certainly. Because blue is our key color, yellow then is very important. Green becomes the next most obvious color because, again, it's more predominant than the orange and it stands out a lot more. And so because of that, and here the blue and yellow create green, it's the analogous color scheme where two colors can be mixed to create the third, which is one of the types of analogous color schemes. There are a few different things, like ways that you can discuss color, that artwork might be discussed. This particular artwork is achromatic, and what that means is without color. If we break it down to the Latin, when you add a to the front of the word, the a means without. Chroma means color. So achromatic means without color. So we wouldn't say that this is a black and white artwork, or this is a drawing in particular, but we wouldn't say this is a black and white drawing. That's not a way that we describe artwork other than photography, because there's color photography and black and white photography. But when it comes to drawings and paintings, if something is in grayscale, you would either say, you would describe it as achromatic, meaning without color. And then you could go on to describe the value in the artwork as a separate element. Pointing out that this is achromatic does not mean that you get credit for color, though, just to kind of point that out. Here we have another monochromatic artwork, the guitar player that we saw in last week's lecture. Now that you understand values, the guitar player and the wall behind him are in blue, the floor and the guitar are in brown, so this is certainly monochromatic. I Don't Care, I'd Rather Sing Than Call Brad for Help. This is a Roy Lichtenstein painting Drowning Girl from 1963. And this particular artwork is complementary. We've got the blue in the hair, and her skin tone is orange. A Caucasian skin tone is created mixing orange and white. Traditionally, we don't see a skin tone as color, simply because it's too subtle, but he's added a lot of orange to the pigment here to help it stand out against the blue hair, and we actually see that subtle intensity of the orange. Here we have Vincent van Gogh's The Bedroom. On the left is what it looks like now, but on the right is what it looked like when Van Gogh painted it. I always show this when I discuss the color scheme because it's important to understand that the wall was violet originally. Light fastness, meaning how well the color stays the same as it is exposed to light, is one of those things that we have developed better and better paints to sustain over time. So you can kind of see how the light fastness of this particular artwork has deteriorated the color itself due to that light fastness, I should say. So knowing that the wall was violet, we've got quite a bit of yellow in the work, and then of course the bold red. And though there's not a lot of red, it is the brightest and boldest color here, and it stands out a lot. And so that certainly was a clear decision that Van Gogh made, and that's a particular reason why it belongs within the color scheme. And then green. We have the green in the window and the green in the floor. There is blue in the artwork as well along the wall and on the table, but all of the blue there is quite subtle in comparison to the other four colors. So this would be a double complement. Here we have the Water Lily Pond by Monet, and this is an analogous color scheme because the majority of the colors here fall into the cool colors. Okay, so we have just a few more of these to go through. The next element is space. Space can be discussed in more than one way, so it's important to kind of understand the different ways that you might discuss space. You can describe it from a two-dimensional perspective in terms of its foreground, middle ground, and background. Not all artworks will have a middle ground. Sometimes an artwork only has foreground and background, and a lot of times because of that, we will describe the positive versus negative space instead. Excuse me. Space is described from actual space, which is usually described as volume in three-dimensional artworks, or implied space, depth, or perspective in two-dimensional artworks, the suggestion of space in two dimensions. The positive versus negative space, or how much space something takes up on the artwork, is another way that you can describe space in an artwork. And that's an important thing to kind of understand, because implied space is not the only way to describe an artwork. So here we have an example of the picture plane. So the picture plane is, like the piece of paper or the canvas. But the ground plane, on the other hand, is the depth. And here we have the foreground, which would be, in this example, the people in the front. The middle ground would be this tree, and the background would be the mountain. The ground plane is, the amount of space that, like the real space as it, goes back. And the picture plane is the suggestion of that space. And what the middle ground does is, the proportion of, the size basically of the tree in comparison to the size of the people gives you an idea of how much space is in between them. And then the size of the tree in comparison to the size of the mountain gives you a good idea of how much space is in between the tree and the mountain. which makes it very clear how far away those mountains are from the people. So that's why that mid-ground or middle ground is so important. Um, but you can still have implied depth without a middle ground, and it can be effective, but most of the time, if you want a deep, like implied space that goes far into the distance, you can't really do it without that um, middle ground. Now, not every artist is interested in showing implied depth. In this particular artwork, because it is a photograph, we do have some understanding of implied depth, but because of the expanse of water and the monotone color of the water and how close the water is to the sky, it's very difficult to see and understand how much space is really there in terms of how far back in space it goes. But instead, we are left with this idea of how much space there really is um, based on the size of the little guy and how much space the water and sky take up. So the positive space of the boat and the man versus the negative space of the water and the sky help us to really understand um, his place in the world, or you know, how small he is in comparison to this body of water. That's different than understanding how far away he is from the shore, which is what implied depth would be used for. Instead, the artist has made a very different decision here, and it becomes more of a philosophical discussion almost, um, whereas it helps us to see, how small he is um, in comparison to his place in the world, how small we are, um, and how big the world is. Here we have a Japanese wood block, and this particular artwork is quite interesting because we do have implied depth here, but that implied depth is blocked off or difficult to fully understand because of the way these two mountains kind of block the space off. However, what's interesting is we also have um, an artwork that is influenced by Western art here. So when Japan opened the Silk Road and we get Japanismo, a movement where Japanese artists are influenced by Western artists and Western artists are influenced by Japanese ones, we start to see things like this. And so this is a certain type of implied depth where they are, in a very abstract way, mimicking the Western ideas of atmospheric perspective. So as you notice, let me kind of skip forward to show you a Western ideal of atmospheric perspective. This is a certain type of implied depth that starts to suggest the space kind of never ending, and it gives the atmosphere kind of a physical presence, kind of like a fog or moisture in the air in some way. Um, and what atmospheric does is it was invented during the Renaissance, like many techniques that we use today, because they observed the way things looked in real life. The the further away an object is, the less distinct it becomes. It becomes paler, bluer, or grayer than the nearby ones because there's moisture in the air that scatters light, and the further you're looking, the more of those moisture molecules you're looking through, and the more distorted things become. Think of it like humidity, right? There's tiny little water molecules in the air, and you know that water creates reflections, so you're looking through these microscopic reflections, and the more and more you look through those, the more distorted things become, and so it starts to create so as you're looking, the further and further you look. So for instance, if you notice in the mountains here, the first step, every little detail is seen. And the next one, it gets a little grayer. Notice there's a lot less detail. And then as we move up, it gets even grayer and it's even duller. Notice even like the points here are lost, and we go up even more. Even now it's almost like shapes. A lot of the form is missing. And then as we move up further, we're starting to get into that atmosphere where it's starting to push away um, everything. And so that's kind of that concept. So if we scroll back, here we have that idea happening with a Japanese artist. They have like an abstract atmosphere. They have the mountains that are here. We have a mountain that is duller and less distinct, and then a mountain further behind it that is duller and bluer, and then the sky that is even less detailed um, and paler and bluer. So they're mimicking that concept of atmospheric perspective. And so if you see, atmospheric perspective and you discuss how the atmospheric perspective is being shown in an artwork, that is using the element of space, um, pointing out, the the deepness of the space and how it influences your understanding of the work is important. There are several artworks you'll notice that we'll look at in many classes because there's so much to them that we kind of unwrap it as a present slowly so that you can glean more and more from it. So here we have Dorothea Lange. The space that she chose to use for Migrant Mother is really important. And I want you to kind of think about this for a second. Um, when she was at the camp, she was there to document the plight of the migrant worker. And she could have chosen a different perspective. She could have photographed um, her from further away, showing her living situation a lot clearer. Um, which could have inspired more people to want to donate. Uh, what she's living in is a makeshift tent because she sold her tent shortly before Dorothea Lange showed up to get food for her family. Her family was living off of the dead plants in the camp and birds her boys could kill. What happened here in Nepoma, California, at this particular camp is that they had an unseasonable frost and it killed all of the pea plants. And the migrant workers that were there um, had, didn't get paid and were all stuck living in the tents at the farm without being able to get home. There was no guarantee of payment. They were going to be paid at harvest, and so she was one of the families that was stuck. This is during the Depression. People from all over America were moving wherever they could to get whatever money they could to survive. And many turned to migrant farming. So it's kind of important to understand that she could have shown that, they're living under a piece of canvas with a tree branch holding it up. And that might have shown, how desperate their situation was. But Dorothea Lange chose not to do that. She chose this close-up view. And there's a reason for it. And it's important for you as the writer, as the analyst, to figure out why. You know, this was a very effective decision. What she's done here is given us Miss Thompson's emotion, her emotional state, um, her desperation but quiet strength, the way that her sons are leaning on her, the way that they trust her and she is their strength. And there is a lot of power in choosing to take up the frame with Miss Thompson. You know, she could have shown how desperate their little camp was, but she would have lost the strength of emotion, that one-on-one connection, the intimacy that is created with this viewpoint. It's within this viewpoint that you connect to the photograph. That's the decision that she made. That is the decision that makes this such a fantastic artwork. And that's why Dorothea Lange was so known for her portrait photography. Another type of perspective that was invented during the Renaissance was linear perspective. This is a mathematical approach by setting up a horizon and a point along that horizon, and all of the lines will kind of recede back to that point and create a very strong perspective. Most of the artworks in the Renaissance use this type of perspective to create space, and then they set the people in the artworks within that so that they can quickly create a believable space, and then spend their time working on the fun parts of the artwork. For instance, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, the fresco, uses linear perspective to set the space up, including the table. The School of Athens uses linear perspective to set the space up. And again, I know I just showed you this, but that atmospheric perspective examples are here as well. The next element is time and motion. Time and motion are always linked in art. Time's the element in which we live, and motion is a sign of life. Because of this, time and motion are one element. It's like two sides of the same coin. So if you talk about time at one point and then you talk about motion later, you're still only getting credit for one element in the analysis. It's really important to understand that. To discuss time and motion, it's also really important to understand, and a mistake that students often make is they start to discuss the element of movement. But movement has a different definition in the art world. Movement is a group style term that's used to describe a group of artists working in the same style, like Impressionism or pop art. And so if you use the element of movement, you will be wrong. If you use the element of motion and then discuss how the artwork moves or the movement of the artwork, that will not be incorrect, but you must discuss the element of motion in that regard. Anything that depicts an event in time, that suggests time, that shows motion, that could move, that would move, that might move, that implies movement, these are things that you would talk about time and motion. When you are dealing with time-based arts like video, film, performance, sound, an interactive installation, which is an installation that you touch a button and something changes, or something along those lines, you must discuss time and motion, because time and often motion are a part of these artworks. When you are looking at photography, photography is the concept of capturing a fleeting moment in time. And so when you are looking at photographs, you should also consider the element of time and motion. We discuss implied motion versus actual motion. Implied is movement that's suggested. Artworks that actually move fall into the category of kinetic art. The definition is art that moves. And so here I have a few examples. In the top left, we have pollution in this abstract graphic style painting. The smog created from the uh, smoke coming out of the chimneys is suggesting motion. On the right here in the PowerPoint online, you can click on it and you can see a 40-second video of it moving in time. But it's a mobile like any other mobile by Alexander Calder, who was the first artist to create a mobile. In the bottom left here, we have the suggestion of time and motion. Time is suggested in the fact that these people look as if they are moving down the road, so that that suggestion of the time it takes. But even if you understand, this is why time and motion are linked, because I also discussed them moving down the road throughout in that time period, right? But we also have the motion of the wind, right? They're like bracing themselves against it. There's like a kite flying through the air. There's papers flying through the air. So all of that suggests motion as well. In the bottom right-hand corner, we have a painting that's suggesting time and motion. We have the sky suggests time. We have storm clouds on the left and a bright sunny sky on the right. The movement of that storm is suggesting the time, right? So it's suggesting both time and motion in that the sky is clearing up. And then we also have a party of people like marching towards the town or away from the town, and that also suggests time and motion. The way that there's this people, it's not really a crowd of people, but line of people that look as if they are heading, there's this town in the background, and it looks as if they're either going towards or moving away from them. And so there's two different suggestions of time and motion in this particular work. So the last two elements that we'll discuss are mass and volume, and they kind of go together. So mass, I define differently than your textbook because it's easier to understand this way. Mass is the physical bulk, density, and or weight of an object. And that would be the actual mass of a three-dimensional thing. Mass can also be implied in 2 dimensions, and that's when you understand the weight in a 2-dimensional artwork. If you can explain the weight in a 2-dimensional artwork because it makes sense, you will describe its implied mass. To get credit for the implied mass in a 2-dimensional artwork, you must always include the word implied. Otherwise, you're dealing with a paradox. You can't have real mass in 2 dimensions because that would mean that you were describing a real physical weight in an artwork that is not supposed to have anything. Volume is about the actual space occupied by a form, which means this refers only to 3-dimensional things because it's referring to real space. If you're talking about implied space, remember, you're discussing the element of space, not the element of volume. So if you describe implied volume, you're getting 2 elements wrong, not 1. Volume can be open or closed. An open volume has larger, negative space that the viewer has access to. Closed space is an artwork without negative space. Mass and volume. All three-dimensional objects have mass and volume, but a description of that mass and volume will differ greatly based on what the object is. So a single sheet of paper or a single feather both have volume because they do take up space, even though it's minuscule. Their mass may be tiny and seem insignificant compared to the weight of, say, a semi-truck. But all three of these have mass. You just describe it differently. We often think of mass as an equivalent to weight. In art, it's often easier to describe it in terms of physical bulk or density of material unless we're familiar with how much that material weighs, because artworks don't sit on scales in museums. And so unless we have personal experience with the weight of the material an object is made out of, we can't describe an object in terms of its weight, and therefore we can describe density and physical bulk. So in terms of a semi-truck, you can talk about how heavy it is and understanding how heavy a semi-truck is because that's something familiar. Understanding how light a single feather is, you can certainly describe its mass as not being heavy enough to hold its own weight, right? If the wind blows, it lifts itself off the ground and flies to another location. But if a sculpture, if you have a large mass of flowers, I guess flowers would work too, of feathers, and they weighed 10 pounds, you wouldn't know that by looking because that's not a reference that we just know. You would see a giant pile of feathers. So the density of those feathers, the sheer bulk of the feathers, that's how you would describe that particular mass, because you might not understand how heavy it is because we think about feathers as something light, and you don't know how many feathers it takes to get to 10 pounds. That's what I mean by sometimes weight is not the most appropriate way to describe something. Now, because volume is simply the amount of space occupied, regardless of how much the weight of those feathers are, it's always going to be easy, regardless of what the artwork is made out of, to describe its volume because you can always see the amount of space it occupies. So here we have the Venus of Willendorf. This is a small 4 3/8 of an inch sculpture made out of basalt rock. So rocks are heavy, but because this is such a small sculpture, this isn't going to have a lot of mass to it in terms of weight. Rocks are quite dense, but the weight of this particular object is still going to be quite small. This was made in prehistory, and it was made so small so that they could carry it around with them, right? So it couldn't have been too heavy. Because it's so small, it also takes up very little volume. And that also makes sense because it couldn't have taken up a lot of space because a nomad had to carry it around. So just to kind of understand that. Here we have an Art Nouveau drawing, and even though this is an abstract artwork, the actual the implied mass here does make sense. We do have a sense of weight. She appears very light, not only because she looks skinny, but because it looks effortless for him. The way that he holds her, it appears to be effortless to hold her up like that. And because of those two things, the implied mass appears to be quite light. Her implied mass appears to be quite light. So to kind of explain the difference between open and closed volume, like I was saying, the closed volume doesn't have negative space and the open volume does. So here, this guy is dabbing and no one can occupy his negative space, otherwise he can't dab. And the guy here is scratching his head because nobody dabs still in 2021. But his body is closed because he's not taking up that negative space. Here we have Cloudgate, affectionately known as the Bean in Chicago. It looks like a kidney bean, along with the negative space underneath it for people to walk through. Because that negative space is accessible and an important part of the artwork, this is what we would call an open form or an open volume. Now, this is a gigantic artwork, so this does have a massive volume. It does take up quite a bit of space. As a public artwork, if you were describing this, you might also consider the space around the sculpture, which is not a part of its volume. It's not the actual space the sculpture occupies, but the square that it's in, the space around the sculpture that people have access to, and how it fits within that square might be something that you would consider. But really, only public sculpture is the only realm that you would consider space other than volume for in that regard. It also is extremely heavy. It took two trucks and two cranes to get it in place. So it is extremely heavy in terms of its mass. Here we have Michelangelo's David. This particular artwork, we would say, has an open form, right? There's quite a bit of negative space here between his legs, underneath his one arm, and the area between his arm here. So there's quite a bit of negative space here. So this is one that I think you could also call an open form. And because this is such a large sculpture, this is a monumental size sculpture, certainly it does take up quite a bit of space, and is extremely heavy as well. Now, takes up a lot of space, is extremely heavy, is super vague. My expectation of you is that you will be able to describe it, your mass and volume, if you are working on a sculpture, say for your final project, in much more better terms than that. We love adjectives in the art world. So this is the last one that we looked at earlier. And these little sculptures, because the sculpture is all of these, the negative space in between them is important. This again would be something that we would consider an open form, an open volume. But this is also quite a small sculpture, right? This is not taking up a lot of space. These do fit on in a small box in the museum, and each rock is not going to be very heavy, so we don't, and even as we look at it, you're not mathematically going to add up what you think each individual rock weighs and then how much the bronze is going to weigh and whatnot. you just kind of look at it and it doesn't appear heavy, right? And so the appearance in this regard, the way that the rocks are spaced out, um, makes the mass seem lighter than it probably really is. That would be my best description. We know that the bronze rocks are going to be heavier than the actual rocks um, due to the material, but um, the appearance of those bronze rocks and the amount of negative space used in the layout, that again, when we talk about physical bulk or density, like the negative space here really lightens the load here in terms of the actual mass. And that concludes the elements lecture.